Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of CFS Alert, another broadcast from Newton, Massachusetts, where I'm talking to Alan Gurwitt. Welcome to the broadcast, Alan. And you, alas, are a patient, and have been for quite a long time. It was back in the 1980s, I believe, when you contracted this ghastly disease.
August 1986.
And you're somebody who knows exactly when you got it, as so many patients do. Tell me about that day.
Well, the previous day I was perfectly well, and the next day I felt terrible, like I had the flu. And for the next 6 months it was a very difficult time. I'm fortunate in that my ME/CFS is relatively mild. I was able to work part-time for many years, but it's a challenge to deal with that.
What was your profession?
I'm a retired physician. I was a child psychiatrist. So my schedule was relatively relaxed and I was able to continue, but on a modified basis.
That's very interesting, because there's been this huge cleavage between the clinicians and the psychiatrists on the subject of myalgic encephalomyelitis, probably particularly acute in Britain, but the tendency of psychiatry has been to say that it's psychosomatic.
Yeah, I must say I'm rather ashamed of my colleagues who are neither up on medicine nor are they aware of the illness, and they've been very resistant, like all other physicians. They are probably not aware of the key shift in 2015 when the Institute of Medicine came through with a wonderful report, carefully done over 18 months, and clearly points out that ME/CFS is not a psychological illness, but is a organic illness. The exact cause is not known. I think the cause for me, or at least the trigger, was toxic chemicals, but the most popular, perhaps rather than popular, the most likely cause is infectious, because the illness occurs both in epidemic form and single case endemic form.
That's one of the very interesting things about the disease, that you have these clusters and you have the individuals. You said a couple of interesting things. That was one, but right before that, you were talking about the misdiagnosis of it by psychiatrists,
including child psychiatrists and pediatricians.
So throughout the medical industry, or throughout the psychiatric industry, there is a
misdiagnosis, if there's any at all, is a real problem, because then recommendations are made that are actually harmful. For example, graduated exercise, well, sounds mild, but it doesn't work that way. Or
we have just had the unmasking of the PACE study in Britain.
Right, which had implied that the disease could be cured or made much better by means of two steps: cognitive behavioral therapy and graduated exercise.
Back again to your earlier, you said that you thought the trigger in your case was industrial chemicals?
Chemicals used to kill poison ivy. It didn't make the connection, but about 2 weeks later, I had a sudden change in my sleep pattern, and I felt lousy for about 2 weeks, and then it went away, and I didn't connect it to the chemicals at all. But the following year, again, I sprayed the chemicals, and within 2 weeks, that's when I got sick in August.
How in your own mind do you separate this phenomenon of clusters, suggesting either a common environmental trigger or infection, and the individual disassociated infection like your own? How do you think about that? How do you...
I think that's a very important question, but I don't think it's been solved as yet. Until we know more about the cause or causes, I don't think that question could be answered. It's a vital question, but...
Journalistically, it's a very challenging one when you know, as I happen to, that you had an outbreak at the Royal Free Hospital in 1955, and then in Klein Village in 84, 85, and upstate New York, 84, 85, where you have every evidence of an infectious disease, or one that has been caused by a common pollutant. Mm-hmm. And yet you have many, many more patients than those in the clusters, which could be up to 300. You have many more patients that are individual in very different places.
Somewhere between 1 million to 2.5 million in the United States. But it's all over the world.
The thing about the two big clusters, the 84, 85 infections, if that's the term, was that the locales were so different. One in California, on the California-Nevada border, is very upscale, very prosperous, and upstate New York, Lindenville, is hard scrapple. It's poor and...
dairy farm area.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yet you had very similar results.
Well, I've been working on the history of the illness. I have a way to go on it, but many people have, but I'm pulling some things together. There were a number of epidemics, small group clusters, bigger group clusters, prior to 1955 and after. But in 1955, there was a major epidemic at the Royal Free Hospital in London involving most of the staff and medical students who trained there. It was carefully studied. It was written up like some of the previous epidemics. And it was decided that it was a neurological illness, and that's where the term myalgic encephalomyelitis comes from. For the next 15 years or so, the thinking was this is an organic illness. And it was rated so by International Statistical Medical Association. However, in 1970, a paper came out by two British psychiatrists saying that epidemic back at the Royal Free Hospital was just mass hysteria. It had nothing to do with an organic illness. And strange as it seems, that paper dominated the thinking about this illness until very recently, and still has an impact. It was like a black cloud that floated over Europe and crossed the Atlantic to the United States of a very mistaken, unfortunately mistaken idea about the illness. The IOM report in 2015, which I mentioned, changed that. Clearly it was an organic illness to the people who studied it, and it was not properly researched. And one of the reasons it wasn't properly researched for many, many years is because of the false thinking that it was a psychosomatic illness.
And that's very important. I would imagine that your book, your history, will be very important, because partly because you have a medical background and a mind that is trained to understand these issues. How is it progressing? When is it likely to be published?
Oh, it's not going to be a book. I hope it will be a paper that could be printed in an journal. But now that I mentioned journals, by the way, it's very clear that most physicians, and we struggle with it in this state, as in much of the world, most physicians are not familiar with the illness, are skeptical about it, don't know how to diagnose it, don't know how to manage it. And that's why there's now a huge emphasis on training physicians. The problem is there's a great deal of resistance in the medical communities, not just in this country, to changing their minds about it. And why there is such a resistance to understanding that it's a organic illness, why there's such resistance to it, I don't really know. That's what I'm trying to find out, how come? Was it that single paper from 1970? Or were there other factors operating that led to the medical profession just pushing it aside?
Or is it kitchen table analysis, where somebody in a family has the disease, it's not diagnosed, and they're assumed to be lazy or to be, so to speak, sick in the head?
Yes.
This is very easy to do without knowledge, without information. I've had a lot of correspondence from people who've been thrown out of their families, particularly boys, where there's very little tolerance for a boy who can't get up and do things. The tolerance is very low, and there's also a socio-economic factor there. The tolerance is lower at the bottom of the scale.
Yeah, so one of the things that pediatricians and child psychiatrists need to do is make clear what the illness is, how it comes about, and that it's not some sort of laziness or issue of not wanting to go to school, that it's a very real illness, and teaching the family as well as the child about it is crucial. There's a prejudice on the part of medical editors against this illness. Many of the major journals in medicine do not want to publish anything on ME/CFS. The New England Journal of Medicine, from this state, but one that goes all over the world and is highly respected, has not printed anything since 1959, and under the current leadership, they won't print anything.
Alan, you've done the basic primer, but you also did a pediatric primer.
Yes, that's not yet published, but it's in the process of being published. That's our most recent one, with a wonderful team of pediatricians from around the world, from Australia, New Zealand, UK, the United States. And it was a very enjoyable but challenging process to write this. It took us 2.5 years. But we're very pleased with the product.
How long are these primers?
This one is long. It's about 44 pages of text, and then it has appendices. We decided early on, all of us, that just to give a superficial account was not really adequate. There is no such thing that exists, so that pediatricians around the world have nowhere to go to find out about pediatric ME/CFS. So we felt we needed to include quite a bit of information about it, but it's got an index, and if people just want to read one section, they don't have to read the whole monograph.
And people will be able to, psychiatrists, this is directed at psychiatrists and psychologists, I imagine.
I certainly hope that psychologists and psychiatrists will also read it.
And they can learn about it at the website of Massachusetts CFS Association.
We've gotten a great deal of help from two national organizations, patient organizations, SMCI and the Open Medicine Foundation, OMF, who have made it possible for us to publish this in one of the journals, and also are going to be very involved in its distribution. We want every pediatrician in the United States to have access to it.
Alan, I thank you for a marvelous conversation and for the excellence of your work.
Thank you.
Cheers.